Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work at Center for Policy Research. This is just the warm-up act before the main show begins. And so if you're here just for fiscal architecture, you can take a 10-minute nap. In the meantime, I'm going to basically take you to 1952 when Indian democracy's journey began. And I'm going to map out these manifestos, what promises these parties have been making, and where we stand. So in popular perception, manifestos are seen as mere formality since they are not binding and there is no concrete evidence that voters read them and there is some effect of these manifestos on voters. But manifestos in some ways are official document of the party and it signals certain things. It signals party's political priorities, ideological vision of the party, it shapes campaign issues, agenda of the work if party get elected, and it can also act as tool of accountability for voters. The motivation behind this project was very simple. I was both inspired and jealous by Comparative Manifesto project, which is hosted in Berlin. And what they have been doing is that they have been coding more than 1,000 parties now in 50 countries. And that has been happening since 1945. And I thought, because the world's largest democracy doesn't have a representation there, we'll start something here at CPR. And so intellectual motivations were what issues are important for Indian parties, how do parties prioritize different issues, and how do they differ on common issues. And do they focus more on valence issues or positional issues? So 30 seconds of political science. Valence issues are those on which parties are going to basically say same thing, such as corruption, such as development, because parties are not going to take different positions on that. But then there are positional issues where parties are going to differ, mostly ideological issues. So what we did, we basically gathered these manifestos of 3 parties, and the reason we had to limit to 3 parties because finding these manifestos were hard. Even some of these parties don't have their own old manifestos, and I'm not kidding about that. And so what we did, we basically used a very simple tool to map the word count. And if you look that in 1952, these 3 parties, the Congress, then the CPI, so we started coding CPIM once it became the main party of the communist movement. So in the beginning, these parties used to have somewhere around 8 to 10,000 words, which increased to 15 to 20 around 70s. And now in 2019, these parties have more than 20,000 word long manifestos. What do they say? That's another matter of discussion. After this, a team of researchers at CPR have been working for last 2.5 years to code these manifestos. We divided these manifestos into domains, or themes. So we came with 7 themes, and then these 7 themes were divided into 41 categories. So 7 themes are political competence, political system, development and infrastructure, welfare, social fabric, economic planning, national security. And then, within each domain, there were certain categories. We read through each line of these manifesto and then coded them into different categories. And after coding them, we got these beautiful or ugly charts, depending upon how you look them. But because there are 17 elections, 3 parties, and 41 categories, so it was very difficult to bring them on one single map. But the idea is this, like these both, so for each party, what we have done, it's taken at the 100% level, and then you can see that different colors appear for different parties. So yes, all parties focus on welfare, but development and infrastructure is second most important issue for the BJP. Whereas for the left, that is the last issue, right? So basically parties not just on domains differ, they also differ on how much space they allocate to each thing. So BJP gives more space to agriculture, INC gives more space to health and education, right? And similarly, left talks a lot about pro-state intervention, whereas BJP talks about physical infrastructure. So within their manifestos, parties talk about very, very different things. What we did here, again, these are some fancy charts, but Those who study political science, they have divided 75 years of party politics into 4 phases. The first phase was between 52 to 67, when there was a Congress dominance at the national and the state level. Second phase was 67 to 89, when Congress dominance at the national level, but in states there is opposition developing. Third party system is when coalition government starts happening at the national level, and fourth party system began in 2014. And if you look at these web maps, basically these are also called spider maps. In the beginning, parties used to focus on national security and political competence. In the second phase, Congress started to focus on infrastructure, where CPM started to focus on political systems. In the third phase, BJP started talking more on development, and INC gets on political competence. In the fourth phase, all parties, so if you look at for all parties, arrows are pointing in one direction. Everyone is basically talking about welfare-oriented goals. Finally, I have 2-3 charts just to show that even within each domain, parties have differed over time, right? So in a country where we, and Rajdeep is sitting here, on television we hear these debates on price rise and inflation, but parties really don't give a lot of space on price rise and inflation in their manifestos. They focus much more on economic goals, broad economic goals that will make India develop by 2050 or those kind of things. But core issues of people are not getting reflected in some of these manifestos, and you could see that BJP has been talking about free market economy in a zigzag fashion, but for the Congress, it starts actually an upward slide after 1991. So some of the things that has been happening in Indian politics are being reflected in these manifestos. Similarly, if you look at the second last column, terrorism is an issue which comes into prominence in India in 1990s. So before that, parties were not actually talking about terrorism. It only takes precedence after 1990s. Look at the first row, which is on external influence. Left talks about anti-imperialism and other things in their manifestos and gives a lot of space to these things. But Congress and BJP don't give space to those issues. So parties, again, within the national security column also talks on very, very different themes. Finally, if you look at, this is a political systems graph. We are going to talk about fiscal architecture and fiscal federalism. So if you look at the first 2 rows, first one is the row on democracy. The world's largest democracy, and democracy finds very little space in manifesto of both BJP and the Congress. In fact, the share of anything related to democracy is declining in the manifesto of these 2 big national parties. Just to conclude, the future plans do include more in-depth analysis of this database and go beyond word count. We do want to match manifestos with the President's address and government announcement, and what parties say and what actually they use in their policies. Third, we do want to launch an interactive website next year, and we hope that through your help, we are going to get manifestos of state-level parties and assembly elections, and will be able to match what's happening in Europe on comparative manifesto project. And hopefully, formal documents of political parties are going to become an important area of study within political science. But all of these are just ideas. All ideas need resources. And you know what I mean by resources, right? And so many of you who might want to think this is an important area of study should consider helping us in doing these kind of research. CPR President will be able to tell you the details on how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rahul. I would now like to invite our panelists to stage. First is Honorable Palanivel Tyagarajan, Minister of Finance and Human Resources Management, Government of Tamil Nadu. Ratin Roy, Senior Visiting Fellow CPR and Managing Director, Overseas Development Institute. And Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive of CPR. Before we begin the panel, I would request you to please launch the report.
Thank you, Rahul, and especially for that last plug. All research costs money, and we could do with all your support. Now that you're just putting it out there, thank you very much. I think in more ways than one, Rahul's presentation just now about political party manifestos lays the foundation for what we're going to discuss in our closing session. Ultimately, all governments of India, the union government, the state government, and indeed the local government, have a set of goals. These are political goals. They are based on a set of negotiations in the act of democracy between political parties and their voters. And their ability to make good their goal depends in no small measure on the terms of the fiscal contract. The ability of governments of India to be able to be well-resourced in order to meet the goals that they have set out to meet. And eventually, it is on the power of the voter to make a choice on whether those goals have been well implemented and effectively implemented. When the terms of the fiscal contract go wrong, the voter gets confused, because each level of government and each level of political party, therefore, at all levels of government, can quite easily turn around and start a blame game. It wasn't me because so-and-so, the government above me did not give me resources, or when it's the national government, they will say, well, we gave the resources, but the state government didn't implement. And so the terms of the fiscal contract get confused and accountability gets muddled. So in more ways than one, this closing panel that is going to talk about the terms of the fiscal contract for 21st century India cuts across and underlies, actually serves as the foundation of everything that we have spoken about in the last 2 days. There are a broad set of challenges that India confronts today in the backdrop of a complex, transformative, and deeply disruptive global order. And in order for India to be able to meet these challenges effectively, it needs to ensure that the terms of the fiscal contract are strong, are based on a deep commitment to federalism, and enabling so that the Indian economy can be both resilient and deeply inclusive. So it's only apt, therefore, that today, as we close this 2-day deliberation that cut across such a wide range of issues, from the rural economy to migration to the challenge of climate, the green transition, that we end talking about the terms of the fiscal contract and the big challenges of fiscal federalism. What will it take for our finance departments in the end? We started today talking about state capacity and administrative reform. At the heart of this is the ability of finance departments to be responsive, enabling, and genuinely participatory, which is in more ways than one an antithesis of how finance departments across the governments of India function today. So let me start by engaging both of you in a conversation about the shifting nature of the fiscal contract in India today. At one level, the Indian Constitution provides us with a regulatory framework within which fiscal actors come together to enable the union, the state, and local governments to pursue their goals. These are the finance commissions, both at the center and the state planning departments, the Niti Aayog at the Government of India, and now increasingly the GST Council too that is coming to play this role. But in the current moment, both against a backdrop of global disruption and the complex challenges of coordination between the center and the state, and with these new institutions of fiscal federalism, or the new fiscal actors rather, like the GST Council, I would argue that at this present moment, the fiscal contract itself in India is undergoing a fairly deep and profound shift. And we are in this moment of transition. And Ratin, I would first like to invite you just to comment on whether in fact we are in this moment of transition and how you see the global context also shaping the terms of this transition.
Thank you, Yamini. It's a pleasure to be back in India. Thank you for inviting me. Well, in a sense, fiscal contracts are always in transition. I used to think that was not true of advanced economies, but events last week in London, where I'm now based, made me painfully aware that it's very easy to move from being a professional finance ministry to a thoroughly unprofessional one in a matter of days. My friends in HM Treasury called me in some distress yesterday. The Chancellor had seen fit to put out an ad, hashtag HM Treasury, saying, thanks to our reforms, a person earning £30,000 a year in London can afford a 3-bedroom terraced house. Well, that's rubbish. And I didn't react much. They were very upset we should resign. I said, this happens in the country all the time, don't worry. So, I mean, people say things and you move on, you know. So the question here is, how seriously do we take the fiscal function in India? You can ask this question, I think, in a very balanced way for all parties concerned, whether it's the central government, the state government, but not the unelected institutions. And the answer there is, I think, the traditional tension in the fiscal contract was between the development imperative and what I have called in my previous work, the compensatory imperative. So India has seen two bargains, political bargains. One is, हम विकास करेंगे, तरक्की करेंगे, सबने बोला, from 1951, ठीक है? And the other is, क्योंकि हमने तरक्की नहीं की, आपको कुछ देंगे. आजकल रेवड़ी कहते हैं, compensatory state. So the state has been under these two tensions. This is as true as state governments also. Because the development project has not been Chinese. It's not been South Korean. When Narega came into play, many reasonably conservative economists, in which I used to include myself, said to me, isn't this terrible? I said, no, it's great. And they said, why? I said, it's the only thing that I've seen work in my lifetime. It's actually worked. No, luckily we have far more things that work. So I think the fiscal contract is less under strain and is more stable when you have a development trajectory that is not so full of ups and downs as India has had. Now, the last 8 years have been a perfect storm in terms of our development trajectory. And therefore, the fiscal contract has come under stress. It's been a perfect storm because, one, I think the central government has been extremely fiscally straitened. I have called it a silent fiscal crisis, the equivalent of a silent heart attack. Simply put, until very recently, the government of India for many years has not been able to collect the taxes that it says it intends to collect. It has not been able to privatize. I'm not commenting on it's good or bad. What it says it will privatize. Now you do that, that's a recipe for fiscal disaster because you cannot collect revenues, I don't care how, by selling your assets or by collecting taxes, you will need to cut expenditures. A consequence of which has been that the size of the central government, measured as a proportion of total central government expenditure, all of it, to GDP, has actually shrunk to 1992 levels. It's a very small state now. It's much smaller than it was in 1985. It's a bigger GDP, so you don't see it, but it's a smaller state. At the same time, the conspicuous decision to dismantle one of the fiscal actors in the contract, I'm choosing this word carefully, I'm saying one of the fiscal actors, the Planning Commission. So I'm not debating the merits or demerits of having a plan. I think it's a reasonably good idea that someone is able to tell me what our GDP will be in 2025. At the moment, there's no official institution in India that can tell you that. The Reserve Bank can't, the Government of India can't, the Finance Ministry can't. That's another matter. That was an institution that actually mediated, if you like, or claimed to mediate the development aspirations of the country and how the Fizz could address it and what the role would be of the different levels of government in addressing the development aspirations. In that job, the Finance Ministry's job was to somehow deal with this consistently low taxation not being sufficient to cover the compensatory expenditures, which therefore results in what is called a current deficit, which is what the government spends not on investment. It should normally be able to fund through taxes and disinvestment at least, and it does not. 70% of our borrowing, between 65 and 70% of central government borrowing, is for current expenditure. So that was the Finance Ministry's traditional struggle in the center. In the States, the Finance Ministry's job as an institution was, in my own state, in Maharashtra, it's quite interesting. It was always subordinate to the Planning Ministry, and its job was to act as a gatekeeper. Planning had the big dreams. Planning dreamt the big Maharashtrian vision. Planning came up with ESIC. Planning came up with food per work. Finance would sit there and say, no, I'm not going to give you approval, ye, wo. So they were always the gatekeeper guys. And that is a traditional colonial function of a finance ministry. In times of stress, I believe what has also happened to the central government is it has reassumed that traditional colonial function of being a gatekeeper. Because it has failed to collect the taxes. Remember, in our fiscal contract, the central government is responsible for deciding how much taxes to collect, both by setting the rates, except GST, and by using the collection mechanisms on a good day to collect taxes instead of other things they seem to be doing nowadays. But so that failure has meant that essentially the business of central government has been that of expenditure control. And let me say that a civil servant, a finance guy I most admire from your state, Mr. Somnathan, it's quite a surprise for me. I was asking people, I said, why is he stuck in expenditure? And I said, oh my God, DA has nothing left to do anymore. Because expenditure is now the main business of the finance ministry. Has it done a good job of it? I think it has done an incredible job under very difficult circumstances of undertaking expenditure control. Is that satisfactory for the fiscal contract? Profoundly not, for two reasons, and I'll stop there. Because I want to segue into PTR for this. The first is, so you do not have a development fiscal conversation going anywhere. Okay, there's nothing, because there's no, the planning commission thing is gone. The finance ministry is not equipped to dialogue with the states. So that development conversation, that shared development narrative is gone. And now we are in political world of, who claims credit for what kind of thing, kiska picture kis pe jayega. Just watched somebody saying that on TV 2 weeks ago, I think. But anyway, but that's not, that's not part of the fiscal contract. There is no medium-term fiscal framework like you would have in a modern economy, which I tried my best to persuade people to do, but they wouldn't do it. Because both the collection of revenue and the decision of what expenditures to sacrifice in a given year are peripatetic. There is no fiscal plan. This hurts the states, because when you can't collect taxes you're assigned to collect, then the states get less. And when you can't, and for expenditure control, the hard budget constraint impacts on the states, because the state's ability to borrow is controlled by the central government. So the states, in a sense, have to meet a hard budget constraint. They have learned how to make it less hard, and finance commissions have been reasonable in understanding. And I must say that my brief interactions, when extensive at once, one time, with the Department of Expenditure, they were also understanding about it. It's not that, people are sitting there, but there is a hard budget constraint there. There is no hard budget constraint for the center. This asymmetry is accelerating. Finally, all fiscal, I think Adam said this, and I think I would reinterpret what you said about Keynes, which has been riffed, I think, to death over the last 2 days. But you can, yes, you can afford to do something if you want to do it, but you may not be able to do something else if you afford to do something that you want to do. So that, I think, has been the case with GST. Because in GST, I don't know what PTR thinks, you'll hear from him in a minute, we had a great tragedy. The secular idea of the Jesuitical economist is that you should have a single tax in a single market. Now, the trouble is that our history in India was that we were taxing indirect taxes at very high levels. And by not having a GST, taxes got cascaded. So I tax an input, then I tax another input. Total tax collection was in the order of about 28 to 30%. Now we confuse the GST with something called the revenue neutral rate, which is the rate at which you would move to a GST without losing any revenue from the cascade. That rate I had calculated when I first came back to India in 2013 would be at least 28, 29, 30%. And it would get worse if you brought in real estate, which we didn't do luckily, and stuff like this. It has to be high, because our tax rates were high. But then the demand from the political establishment, both political parties, was that, no, sell me a dream. There are enough people in India who can do that. We're very good at literature. That, let's do 14%. And one chief economist came and said, we'll put in gold somewhere, we'll do that. Nothing happened. Effectively, the revenue neutral rate was not sufficient to be able to run a GST with levels of indirect taxation flowing to the states in magnitudes that it was flowing in the very bad, very distorted regime we had prior to GST. So now we have landed up yet again in GST, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, with the trivialization of GST. It breaks my heart to see finance ministers of the states sitting in the GST Council arguing about a 9% tax on hotels that sell their rooms at 3,000 rupees versus an 18% tax on hotels. That was not the idea. If you wanted to do that, our old system was much better. This is a trivialization. This is a circus that seems to be happening. So I think that institution has failed. The Finance Commission was put under immense pressure the last time, but again, this is why institutions are very important, to declare that only states undertook populist expenditures and to try and ring fence a part of the common budget for defense. They wrote very good English. We have good civil servants. and managed to get around the problem. So we are essentially intact. The states have not been sort of penalized for alleged populist expenditure. I don't know what will happen next. But, and defense, we have used English to make sure that it remains part of the general budget, which is a good thing. One final thing I want to say about the central government. The central government has a very important responsibility, which I think institutions have managed to deliver, which is to maintain macroeconomic stability, an important part of which is fiscal stability. These things you have to be very vigilant about. I'm 55 years old. In my lifetime, I think since 1992 at least, I have seen every 2 or 3 years, someone coming in saying India should borrow abroad sovereign. Every 5 years somebody comes, and the World Bank and the IMF guys, they say it like Jesuits read, the almanac. You should borrow abroad because you're getting money cheaper. And somebody hoodwinked. We had a hiatus. We had a new finance minister. I don't know what happened. And I saw this announcement in the budget speech. And the budget speech is very important. Because when you say something in the budget speech, you think hard what you're wishing for. Because you're supposed to implement it. You're accountable to Parliament what you say in that speech. Throwaway line on sovereign bonds. Institutions in India were robust enough for the finance ministry to put that back in the freezer. So our institutions of finance are working, but they're under great stress. The contract between the center and the states are under great stress, and now with this new period of macroeconomic instability that is coming in, I have been warning about this. I did the finance ministry. For the first time, we are seeing a macroeconomic trinity arising, where India is running a significant current account deficit, a high fiscal deficit, an aspirational growth rate, and a monetary policy which I cannot quite understand, but certainly is necessary to tackle high inflation. That new challenge, I think, is going to stress our fiscal institutions even more, because the one institution we have refused to bring up, and everyone from the Controller Auditor General down to, well, frankly, many finance ministers have rejected, or I see Mr. Bose here, former finance secretaries have rejected. I can say that to him, he was my boss once. So, is the idea that the consequences of a fiscal action should be costed and put out there in the public domain by an independent body, which in the FRBM committee we were part of, we called a fiscal council. You're seeing this being trivialized in the country I live in now as I speak. There is an Office for Budget Responsibility there, which every time a budget is presented tells you what the macroeconomic implications are going to be going forward. This Chancellor did what we have never done, so it makes me very sad. He said, I don't want your report. I'm going to present a budget and I want you to shut up. And they had to shut up. So that part of the fiscal architecture, that last institution, is missing and needs to come in. I think, therefore, I can conclude that there are challenges, and the challenges are particularly in the center-state sphere because of lack of resources. We are running a smaller state, and that is a worry. And there are macroeconomic challenges which need new institutions like fiscal councils, which are not forthcoming, and the GST Council has failed, and somebody has to have the courage to stand up and say that and think about how we revamp it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ratin, for laying that out. I'm just going to add 2 more aspects to the underlying complexity that is making the current moment particularly unique before I ask you, PTR, for your responses. One, of course, is the nature of our developmental trajectory. So, the southern, western states versus the northern, some parts of the northern and eastern states, and the very, very divergent developmental trajectories, which certainly in the near future are not going to converge, as was anticipated in the early 90s as the Indian economy had its first coming out party. But related to that, perhaps because of this divergence, the Indian economy is in more ways than one more deeply integrated today than it ever has been before. And I think we saw this in the most visible form in the early part of the COVID 2020 March lockdown, when you saw, just if you trace patterns of movement, who went back and from where, you know that labor is deeply integrated. We know that goods and services are deeply integrated. The fact that Punjab went into a panic in early April during harvest season because the jute bags are made in West Bengal, and West Bengal had not declared its jute mills as an essential service. So suddenly everything was about to fall apart, and it took various Twitter interactions and letters to get. So, the Indian economy is deeply integrated at one level, so it needs a kind of coordination that is unprecedented. I think GST was an attempt at trying to build that coordination, at least on taxation, and at the same time so divergent that is coordination even possible, because what Tamil Nadu needs is one level is completely different to what Bihar needs. So we're talking about a fiscal architecture in the context of multiple countries. You have the economy of Bihar with the economy of Tamil Nadu, all trying to cohere in some senses. So can we even think of coherence of a fiscal architecture in this context?
So much to unpack. So let me just maybe talk about 3 or 4 things. I don't know if it's a silent fiscal crisis that's driving it or political considerations, but there's been a very clear grab of control and whatever the opposite of devolution is, centralization of financing at the union in multiple ways. The simplest way is to talk about how much of our tax money we get back from the union comes as share of taxes as opposed to grants and schemes. So because of this great surge in cesses and surcharges and shifting of money out of the taxable pool, we get much less of our total devolution in untied funds and much more of it tied to specific centrally sponsored schemes. I was in some other seminar with Mr. N.K. Singh where he said really states should have objected 20, 30, 40 years ago when the notion of centrally sponsored schemes came, and the fact that it's now being done on steroids, it's too late. You should have objected at the right time. Maybe he's right, I don't know. But in a lot of cases, what happens is that politics and branding basically trumps impact or logic. So, for example, I was over yesterday and today at various meetings with the Union Finance Minister, the Secretary, other officials. And one of the amazing, a bit Twilight Zone conversations we were having was whether the money they were sending us for certain schemes were being put into the right account at the right time and the right data was going back or not. Let me be very specific. So about 10 or 12 years ago, we started, more like 17, 20 years ago, we started paying some basic pension to widows and elderly and disabled people. I think it started at 500, then became 1,000. Somewhere along the way, the union government decided to pay 300 rupees to some smaller subset of beneficiaries than ours. So now we pay 1,000 to, 5 million women. And the union government sends us 300 rupees towards some couple of million people. But they want us to put the money into one account that they can track and take back the detail of every beneficiary. Now, if I put all of my money into that account, then really I can have one check sent or one payment sent. But then, they get a lot of more information and credit for things that we are doing that they were not doing, and we were doing before they dreamt of doing it. It's not even that, they started the program, right? So this kind of inane data collection with no obvious kind of developmental or planning value other than political value, I think, is an example of that. Now, if I take our own state, I would say, as much as I would worry or complain that the union's devolution to us has kept on dropping and has dropped dramatically, right? For example, at one point we were about 7.5%, 8% of the population, 7.5%, 8% of the economy, and our share of taxes was 7.5% or so. Now we're about 6% of the population, we're about 10% of the economy, and our share of taxes is 4% or so. That means, as I said, very openly to the Finance Commission, if efficiency was one of your 3 stated goals, then 25 years of Finance Commissions have failed miserably because you've kept on transferring the money and you've kept on widening the gap. The whole point of transfers is to make more equitable the quality of life, and that has failed. And what that does, it keeps on cutting the revenues we get, and it changes the dynamic completely. So a state like Tamil Nadu, about 70% of our budget is our own funds and 30% comes from the union. It used to be probably 60-40, now it's come more like 70-30. They've cut their funding. But then you go to states like Bihar, and probably 75% of their budget is from union funding. And then you go to states like Goa or the Northeast, and like 90 or 95% of their budget is from union funding. So, the alignment of these kinds of ratios profoundly impacts places like the GST Council. In the GST Council, if you go with one vote for one state, irrespective of the scale or the contributions in collections, there is a fundamental conflict of interest. Every small state and every net beneficiary state is for raising taxes. And that's only indirect taxes, right? And people like us, not only are we inherently against raising taxes, because if we raise a rupee of taxes, we get back 30 or 25 or 35 paisa, but more that we don't want indirect taxes to be so high. And we don't have control of direct taxes. Only the union has control of direct taxes, which they've cut dramatically as a percentage of total taxation. So in that sense, our flexibility, our ability to apply our own philosophy of fairness in taxation or revenue raising, all of these have changed. And not for the better, let me say. I would say two more things. One, independent of that, states-owned revenues have taken a beating as well. States-owned revenues as a percentage of our GSDP. At one point, let's say in 2011, we were raising about 10.5% of our GSDP in states-owned revenues and getting about 4.5%. So we were as good as 14.5% was the budget, and we were able to do a lot of things. Pre-pandemic, ours had dropped to 7%, and the centers had dropped to 3%. So, our share of devolution taxes came down. And suddenly we were running massive deficits. But there's a very clear correlation in my view that the political will to raise rates and taxes must exist. And if you don't have an elected government, in our case in Tamil Nadu, we had a bit of an aberration that the lady who was elected died within a few months of taking office. And so some people who were effectively backdoored in did not have the courage to do the right thing. But generally, politicians don't want to be, courageous. Right? That's a wrong word. But unless you can fix some of those things, really it's a perpetual decline. Lastly, I would say that there's inherent unfairness in the whole fiscal responsibility structure, in the sense that the FRBM applies to the union, but I think somebody told me the other day, I was abroad for a long time, so I don't have the data, but I'm told that in the 18 years since the adoption of FRBM, the Act has been amended 18 times to keep delaying the target dates. In the state, we have done slightly better. If you take Tamil Nadu, for example, we went from something like 28% debt to GDP down to a low of 16 or 17 over 11 or 12 years till Ms. Jayalalitha was alive, or in the saddle, shall I say. And we went from something like 22% of interest as a percentage of revenue down all the way to about 11. And now it's come back again. But how many ever times we amend our FRA, the Responsibility Act of 2003, it doesn't matter, because every year we get a letter from the Union Finance Ministry that says under Section 293.3 of the Constitution, since you already owe us money, we are going to limit your borrowing to X rupees down to the last crore. So we have this one rule for you, one rule for me model of fiscal discipline, where the union continuously can do whatever it wants once it gets Parliament to pass the amendment. The states can pass how many ever amendments they want. It doesn't matter. The union tells you what to do. And it was such an imposition that even our predecessor government actually refused to participate in the interest-free 50-year loan because we thought it was trapping us into 293.3. And then, of course, it became clear they were going to enforce it anyway, because all the externally aided projects are back-to-back loans to cover sovereign risk and FX and all that. So they were going to use that loophole to consider us in debt to them, even though it was the World Bank's money. So then we also caved and participated. But under that framework, for example, last year, our fiscal deficit now, the final account looks something like 3.35. The unions is, at least stated in the RE, was closer to 7. So, I don't think the Constitution envisioned that there would be a big brother who could do whatever and then tell us that we had a different set of rules. And there's some other arcane stuff. So I worry that we are into a lot of the minutiae of telling us what tax we should cut at what time, what money we should raise at what time, when they already have macro control on us. They try to further kind of insert and direct traffic from Delhi, which of course doesn't go down well with us, because in the Constitution we're equal levels of government, we're parallel, not a hierarchical structure. And so we don't like to give up our constitutional rights that the people elected us gave us. And this is bringing instability to the relationship. And I would say the GST Council, for all the talk of federalism, the voting pattern is very clear, right? 1/3 of the vote is with the union, and 2/3 of the vote is split between 31 states equally. As I've already said, there's a conflict of interest between net donor states and net recipient states in how they vote. But if you want to pass an amendment, you have to get 75% vote, which means that anything the union wants to veto is dead on arrival. Anything the union wants to do, we'll have to line up at least 12 or 13 states to stand up and say no. And there are not that many net donor states. So it's very difficult for us to control what they want to do, and they can stop anything we ever ask for. So I don't really see that as a federal construct, though in theory it is. And even at a more micro level, though it's supposed to be a federal entity, the agenda for the meeting is set by the union government. What matters can be taken up or not, how GOMs are constituted. I mean, some discussion happens, but at the end of the day, if you're the secretariat and you send out some document, it's not written into the constitution, who shall be a member, who shall be the convener and all this stuff. So a lot of inefficiencies and kind of biases creep up into that as well. So I would say overall, the redeeming variable for large states like us is that we have so much in our control that we can still improve, that we can muddle through. But if you ask, do we feel like there is a federal structure that is cooperative or conducive or based on discussion, the answer is absolutely not.
Thank you. I think at the heart of what you're saying is a fundamental challenge, Ratin, and I'm curious to hear how you think about this, because I don't think there are good answers to this, which is, in the federal structure, one of the driving foundational first principles is the principle of horizontal equity, right? But how do you achieve equity against a backdrop of deep structural inequality, but even more importantly, wide variation of state capacity? So, what Tamil Nadu can do with devolution and central schemes is at a very different level in terms of outcomes to what Bihar can do. But just on pure first principles, Bihar needs that money too, and we're all part of a union, and on first principles, minimum standards of public services for all citizens. So how do we balance these concerns in designing the nature of our fiscal federal architecture, again against the backdrop of deep interconnection, critical need for coordination, and there will always be some tension of give and take, given this inequality is not going to go away?
Yeah, I think that is the sort of almost existential question.
Yeah.
I hope people here who are much younger than me will remember, because you're going to have to face this crap that's coming at you. I'll be dead. Because it's going to take time. This is a big country. No, because it is a very serious matter. And I think what Mr. Tyagarajan said related to something. Let me first tell you, in my generation, what I have seen in terms of the fiscal compact in the domain of inequality. I have seen incredible generosity. I am quite struck that people don't understand this. When I worked for the 13th Finance Commission, so you'll remember, and also remember the 14th, when we went to the states never said, even the mild things that Mr. Tyagarajan is saying today. They said, Maharashtra, my state, would say, Marathwada is very poor. So it's not fair that you're not giving us enough money to take care of Marathwada. Goa just said, don't bother to come even. Come in July when it's the monsoon. They combined our visit to the film festival. Which was great fun. Kerala took us seriously. Punjab took us seriously. West Bengal took us seriously. Why? And this is the other odd thing. So factoid one. Sorry, I didn't finish the first point. Between 40 and 50% of the horizontal devolution formula in India since the first Finance Commission has been devoted to the inverse of the gross state domestic product, which means the poorer you are, the more you get disproportionately. And I have not seen a state object. Arvind Mehta did in Himachal. But other than that, I don't remember any state political leader objecting to this. That was, for me, a very inspiring thing as an Indian. That is one country, you see. Cut to number 2, objective fact number 2. The 3 problem states I mentioned to you, I used to call them our lost souls fiscally. I hope they're all much better now. West Bengal is. They cut DNS allowance like maniacs and got back into fiscal stability. And the occasional defaulters I used to get worried about with Tamil Nadu. From time to time, they would sort of tumble. Haryana, because Haryana is entirely dependent on mafias in Gurgaon. Gurgaon chalta hai, to Haryana chalta hai. Anyway, but the Garib states, UP, Bihar, MP, models of fiscal rectitude. Absolute models of fiscal rectitude. Not running revenue. So, the fact that they were getting money disproportionately and generously given by the richer states did not mean they were profligate. They were not profligate. And this was a very sound fiscal architecture. Fast forward now to the silent fiscal crisis, which is resulting in a significant proportion of the divisible pool being taken away. And you're seeing states under fiscal pressure because the center is taking away money because the center is not able to cut taxes. So you have a very difficult context in which to deal with the second problem of inequality, which really worries me. North India and Eastern India export labor to South India and West India. You all know that. We call them migrant labor because they're not Indians. They're North Indians who go, come back. Right? So they're not like my grandfather who came from Bengal and settled in Bombay and now from Maharashtra. Oh, no. Now when they go to Tamil Nadu and Kerala, they're considered migrants, or to Bombay, they're considered migrants. Okay. But North and East India also export capital because the credit deposit ratios of our banking system are negative for North and East India. So what are you seeing here? You're seeing basically the parts of India where fewer people live and where prosperity is centered are importing factors of production from the North and the East. And I thought this was okay because if you look at the fiscal compact in these terms, all right, so you're doing this, you're making some money, you're sending it back to the Finance Commission to the relatively poorer states. But this cannot continue. This is an existential problem because unlike England or any other country I can think of which has similar problems of regional, the majority of my people live in the North and the East. How can you in the foreseeable future not increase, in fact widen, I think you've talked about this once, the gap in prosperity between the places where the majority live and the places where the relatively non-prosperous minorities live? Add to that the fact that most of that majority speaks one language, plus Bengali. Add to that the fact that, well, never mind. So this is going to put strain on the fiscal contract because tomorrow, if the southern states say that since we are going to now permanently lose political power, and I'm being very frank about this really worries me, with delimitation, unless we can put it in cold storage yet another time. Luckily, it's been cold storage all my life. I was 5 years old when the last delimitation happened, and then we have always kicked it down the road. That's fine, do it, please. You're going to be in a situation where the majority of political power is in North India and Eastern India, and the economic power is in West and South India. And then the willingness to share fiscal resources is going to be the dagger in India's fiscal contract. So we have to stop being self-congratulatory. I've written about this, about being the 5th largest economy in the world. All right? We are a very poor economy in terms of per capita income, and the per capita income of UP, this will shock you, is less than Nepal. Whereas the per capita income of Tamil Nadu is that of Indonesia. So I think this is the biggest strain that is coming from our inequality to our fiscal contract, and we have to come up with a common solution to this. Otherwise it will descend. It's okay to do tutu meme when it comes to welfare handouts and compensatory state. This is far more serious, existentially so.
Well, I mean, you've made visible the elephant in the room. Minister Tyagarajan, would you like to comment on this? Because it really is at the heart of the challenge we're going to confront going forward.
Yeah, it's not the transfers that worry us, right? I mean, we're good citizens. We're all part of the same country. Of course, the labor I was aware of, I always knew that our credit to deposit ratio was greater than 1. But I didn't quite think about other states. And after Ratan wrote a column, I was made aware right? But, bankers go where the credit is good. You can't control that, right? It's the fact that I see no path that takes us from here to greater equitable outcomes that worries me. And there is something profound that money cannot fix that is going wrong in the poorer, mostly Hindi belt North Indian states. That something is structurally wrong, because this wasn't always the case, right? If you started independence, I think the best to worst was like 2:1 at most. And then it kind of stayed maybe within that range till about the 80s. And then, deregulation and liberalization and globalization kicked in. And those that had built the infrastructure for it took off. No problem. But in every other federal structure, whether it's, the European Union or the United States or China, the transfers of wealth from the better off to the less well off bring some level of convergence in human development, in social development, in opportunity, in education, in infrastructure, something. Here we've kept on increasing the transfer magnitude and ratios, and it has not only not led to convergence, it has not stabilized. It is not just widening, but the divergence is accelerating. So something is, there's no path from here using this approach that gets us to any good outcome. That's what worries me. It's not the money that worries me. It's we are on some path that simply cannot deliver an outcome that is acceptable.
No, so one response to that could arguably be a stronger role for the union government. I mean, in the sense that if you keep with, just for the sake of provocation, if you keep with the argument that minimum standards of public services for all citizens, and if some parts of the country are being unable to enable that, does that not open the window for stronger centralization? I'm being purposely provocative. So. No,
I think it was N.T. Ramarao who said that the union is a mirage, it's an apparition. Because it's a construct that is composed of human beings, both politicians and IAS officers who come from the states, who rotate in and out. Nobody is permanent, I think, so far in democracy. Everybody comes and goes. So on that basis, the union, how many employees does the union have? How many square feet of land does the union have? There is no way for you to implement things by the union. You can try to direct traffic, that's the best you can do. But all of the implementation falls either on the states or the local bodies, and this union government increasingly wants to bypass the states and go to the local bodies. And they are not able to achieve the outcomes, right? I mean, your own reports or the CAG's reports show us how many centrally sponsored schemes. Simply, I don't think there's been a single centrally sponsored scheme or a single cess or surcharge collection in the last maybe even 10 or 15 years, I'm not only attributing it to this government, has ever achieved its objective or been spent fully for that purpose. It's not possible, right? I can have intent, but I don't have the execution capability that needs to be done by somebody else. So I don't see how greater centralization gives you any good outcome. What I would say, if it were up to me, the two things I would say is free up the states to do more of their own adaptation to their circumstances. We've already talked about how diverse they are. But much more importantly, the core, the basic of human psychology is to align incentives to outcomes, right? I mean, if you keep on paying people to be poorer, how is that going to make them less poor, right? You pay people based on intermediate measures. And I wrote that in our submission to the 15th Finance Commission. I said if there's a lesson we take from Tamil Nadu, it is that the more you empower women, the more you give them equal rights, the longer you keep them in school, therefore you delay marriage, therefore you delay childbirth, therefore you lower the total fertility rate. There is a profound difference between the richer and poorer states on that statistic, with the possible exception of Gujarat, which is an economically advanced state which has very low statistics on that. But every other developed state, particularly the southern states, have a clear distinction on those measures. And there's profound, decades of research that show this truth. And if you don't keep half the population in school beyond, let's say, 8th or 10th grade, there's no path from here to there, right? We are in a global economy. We have to worry about weighted average productivity. And though we're a federal society, in fact, things are not that fungible or that permanent. As Ratan says, they're not permanent transfers of labor, they're migrant labor, right? So somewhere along the culture, the language, some dimension makes it not quite as fungible, let's say, as China or the United States. So in that structure, unless you align the incentives, so I had suggested two things to the Finance Commission. I said, first, the odds that you can predict 2 years forward and then 5 years from there, what each state's GDP and economy is going to be like and the union is going to be like, and based on those, try to make allocations that are permanent and rigid for 5 years and all that, exactly zero. We are not able to do MTFP planning for 2 years of our own states that well. So rather than having a fixed formula, keep it floating and put some ceiling and some floor, and you can resolve another problem and say no state should get less than 30% of its tax collection back, and no state should get more than 10x or 15x or whatever, because the small states are so small, the numbers will work for you. And say it's floating based on your achieving intermediate targets that we know can get you from here to there. Increase the percentage of girls in school. Increase the stay in school rate and reduce the dropout rate of all students in elementary school or middle school. These are the things, or improve the primary health delivery, reduce infant mortality. These are things that are measurable in the short term. And these can be incentivized through money, and if you achieve these, then you are in a virtuous cycle. But if if the greatest weight is population count and gap to full productivity, like how poor you are, how do you expect people to align their incentives in some other direction? You just get paid for being worse off. It's a losing proposition on day one.
So I think one of the, at the heart of what you're also saying is that we need to have clear pathways of how we are achieving whatever sets of goals we have articulated for ourselves, political goals or goals of developmental goals. And this sort of brings me back to one of the points, Ratan, that you made right in your opening remarks about the shifting, about the nature of the institutional architecture that supports all of this. Do we have the, absent the process of planning perhaps, what kind of institutional architecture do we need that will unpack a set of goals into a set of processes that are come together to meet that goal, and how do we do this in a way that's genuinely deliberative? So you've been speaking a lot about the idea of a fiscal council. Is that the space for it? How would that also build a space for center-state dialogue around this? Because ultimately these goals have to be determined in collaboration.
Well, you see, this is a very important question. Again, you've asked, Yamini. I think best way I can illustrate this is by my own lived experience. So, Mr. Kant was very kind in 2016 to invite me to Niti Aayog because we were discussing how to do a medium-term process. He's been very supportive, I must say, all those years. So you're sitting there, and I said, okay, so if we need to have a medium-term, remember the plan strategy thing that was happening? They abandoned it. Now only $5 trillion. So the idea was, I said, okay, so if you want to talk about India in 2030, basic questions as an economist. What will be the share of agriculture? What will be the share of manufacturing? What will be the share of services? What do you want? Then, what will our import and export composition be? And from that, then you can say this will be my fiscal envelope, and that's how you do business and build a deliberative narrative. But you cannot build a deliberative narrative if nobody in the government of India, it's not the job of the states, can tell me what India's structure is going to be in 2030. I don't know any. There is no definitive document which lays this out. There's no government policy that states in the kind of, and I so regret criticizing the Planning Commission for this, the crappy stuff, frankly, they used to bring out. At least I had some kind of plan to say this is rubbish. And I'd fight with Pranab Sen and say that, you've done rubbish here and you've done. But we were talking about a GDP growth rate for India in 2030. I was not just saying $5 trillion economy. You can't have a conversation based on that kind of number, because I can give you that in 9 ways. Or Atmanirbhar Bharat, these are good ideas. Or exports. So if I tell you that exports for India, India being an export-led economy, I'm now 55, I've been hearing this from the age of 20. So I began to think of it much like Mahatma Gandhi thought about Western civilization. When people say we should be exporting, I say, yeah, good idea, karo. You have tried SEZ, you've done everything. Export karo. I'm not preventing you from exporting. But you're running a current account deficit. So if you're going to therefore say that is India, okay, let me ask another question. Is India going to be running a current account deficit when it becomes a $5 trillion economy, yes or no? That is a conversation that people can subscribe to, because that is not ideological. You may have different ideologies that direct you to different ways of achieving it. That is well possible. And we know from our history that fiscal decisions that are made by states with radically differentiating ideologies are compatible. Kerala has made a choice which is remarkable for its citizens. I mean, the Gulf helped. But, the fact that there is no poverty in Kerala, there's 100% literacy, political systems work. The reason they had such bad COVID numbers was that people were actually going to hospital, because Kerala has hospitals, everywhere you look. Backwaters selling newspapers, incredible place. But that's a very different political model from, let's say, Haryana, which is also a successful model in that sense. They're the first people to get buses into every village. So these choices you can make, but you have to be clear at the strategic level. What is this beast called India that you want to see in the shape of an economy in 2030? And that clarity we have lost. Because we have lost that clarity, there is no point in doing medium-term fiscal instrumentation. Because medium-term fiscal instrumentation cannot be done without nesting that fiscal instrumentation in a vision of the structure of the economy in 2030. No one wants to do that. And therefore we will go on being peripatetic. As I told people this, I said, I've been saying this for years. I said, you will run your finance ministry on a note sheet, little green bits of paper, and not a medium-term expenditure framework, as long as you do not have a document that tells you, maps out what India is going to look like in 2030, and that's a conversation then the states can engage in. That's a conversation so the other conversation, let me give you one final example and stop. As you know, sir, Tirupur is a major textile hub. South Gujarat is a major textile hub. I happen to speak a little Gujarati, and because I'm from Bombay, very badly, and I'm familiar with Tamil Nadu, because So I went to Tirupur, and I said to them, this shirt I'm wearing, many of you have heard this before, I apologize. This shirt costs 3,000 rupees. It's Marks and Spencer. It costs the same in London as here, 95% made in India. Wow, bhai. That doesn't mean India has become an export powerhouse, because the 400 rupee shirts that Indians earning the minimum wage can afford are imported from Bangladesh and Vietnam. So I went and asked these guys, I said, why are you doing this? Why are you not making money of volume? They said, no, we don't have the, it's very expensive, labor is very expensive. I said, no, it's not expensive in Gorakhpur, go to Gorakhpur. They said, there are no skills there. I said, all the people from Gorakhpur are sitting on your shop floor in Tirupur. What do you mean no skills? 6 Indigo flights going every morning, Coimbatore, Lucknow. Then came the real answer. They said, we don't want to go there. And that is something that we will have to overcome. You were hinting at this. We have become a very low fraternity society. And therefore the idea that I will let labor migrate, and this is, by the way, hurt Tamil Nadu and Kerala. I think I've told you this before. Tamil Nadu missed being South Korea because it got cheap migrant labor from UP. So rather than, create a society where you pay people well, which was the right of Tamil Nadu to do, this availability of cheap labor from the north, let them be like all of us, which is okay, it was good for the country, I suppose. But they would not invest there. But they were perfectly willing to import labor and import capital to Tirupur and to Gujarat. Now, this is a political economy issue which has serious fiscal implications. Because if that prosperity came to Bihar and UP, half the things that we are talking about now would cease to be problems. And it's okay. I mean, we can always subsidize Assam. There's a place in England called Wigan. Nothing could ever happen in Wigan, so we'll subsidize Wigan. Good. But, you can't say that for the whole north. And then you add Norfolk to it, and then you add Scotland to it. I mean, you're going to get into trouble, right? So, and here we're talking about 60% of my country being subsidized by 40%, where the majority of people live. So these political economic conundrums, if we do not put at the center of our conversations going forward, the fiscal architecture will be pretty facile and meaningless. No point having a fiscal council if you don't know what your GDP is going to be in 2030. I mean, then what's the point, right? To again quote from Adam's speech yesterday, therefore, here I agree with Keynes. If we can do it, we can afford it. But what do we want to do?
Minister, how are states thinking about this question? After all, with very few exceptions, most states have fairly punishment posts have made their planning departments punishment posts. I think, it's important also to remember that while there's a vibrant ecosystem, many of us in this room participate happily in it around the union budget where lots of scrutiny happens, and there's one day in the year when pundits have a lot of work. It's the day of the union budget. But, days after, state after state after state are presenting their budgets. And for the most part, the data from PRS tells you the budget is presented in the morning, and before the afternoon it has been passed. Often it's impossible even to find the budgets. So how do we create a sort of state-level ecosystem and environment that also takes this part of the process of what shapes fiscal architecture and actually shapes the dynamics of fiscal federalism more seriously?
I don't know how common this is, but in my state, I'm the Minister for Finance, Pensions, what we used to call personnel administrative reforms, but also planning, development, and special initiatives.
So is your planning secretary the punishment post or not is the question.
So after we came, we revived the planning commission. It used to be called some planning development council or something, and used to be like a sinecure for aging, semi-retired politicians. So we basically changed that and brought back economists and industry leaders and so forth. And they help us in many ways. But to be fair, the power that they had when it used to be a planned versus non-planned budgeting process is simply not there anymore. So I think in our case, because we have consciously tried to bring as many experts, as many specialists, as many visionaries into the process, we are trying to create these documents like our Chief Minister has, much like the 5 trillion for the country or 1 trillion for our state. And rather than just leave it as a number, we say the path to 1 trillion. Which sectors, what periods, what growth rates, how will it mature, what should the shape of the curve be like, things like that. But I think there's a more profound problem here. I think, leave fiscal out of it. I think the way finance departments are run, and I'm assuming that Tamil Nadu is not that far behind the national average. And I visited a few of my friends and seen some other states. Surprisingly, Odisha is a bit ahead because they've taken on some IMF recommendations and implemented them a bit earlier than other people. But But no, I mean IMF system improvement recommendations, not economic policy recommendations. But compared to my professional experience, for example, we are operating in the dark. The data is not real time. It's not even like remotely. It takes 30 days to 60 days to get a true picture of what has happened. There's so much attention on the budget. Much less attention on the revised account. And by the time you present the final accounts, the revised estimates, maybe some people think about it. By the time you present the final accounts, in most cases, the final account is only fully presented when the next year's budget is being, that is, T-1's final account comes up when T+1's budget is being presented. By that time, the attention is all on the budget. So, all these budgets are only statement of intent. If you go back and actually look at the final account and compare it to the budget, it didn't used to be this way. And I'm saying this apart from politics. It used to be, at least in my state, that they were fairly well synchronized, that they executed what they said they were going to do. But then it got really bad, like 20-30% variations between, forecast and budget and revised estimate, final account. And that last part I could never figure, because we do cash accounting, right? So if after 9 months of data you're not able to come within sniffing distance of the final account, then you almost start wondering if it's willful kind of manipulation of the accounts. But we're fixing that. And so I would say having a good platform, having relatively immediate data. I think real time is hard. But for example, we spent 200 or 300 crores in the predecessor government building a integrated HR and financial management system. It did okay. This 3 days ago, I got a presentation to, take it to the next level and cost another 150, 160 crores. I said, do it. I mean, we have this year will be a, 25, 26 lakh crore economy and a 4 lakh crore or something budget. It's a no-brainer that we should build infrastructure and integrate everything into cashless and so forth. So I think the moving parts of managing state finances are quite complex, much more so than, let's say, large corporates. But the infrastructure to actually manage it is very, very weak, maybe 2 decades behind. We're trying to fix that in our state. I think other states will have similar efforts. There's also the question, at least in the state government, at least in our experience, the finance ministry has a unique kind of, cachet or a projection or a fear maybe even. And so normally the finance ministry is not allocated based on any other variable except seniority in the party, because it's such a powerful post. And so many people who have sat in the chair of finance minister, at least in Tamil Nadu's experience, have not really been very specialized in either finance or administration or accounting or any of the things that help you do that job. So I think the architecture of the states, I mean, the union government may be slightly better in some ways, maybe not in other ways, but the architecture of the states to build a management platform to run the finances could do with a lot of upgrades. And the more you're driven by data, of course, the better decisions you make. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Thank you. I think there's been some consistent themes through the course of the 2 days. State capacity, state capacity, state capacity. Just a little plug for why we at CPR think it's so important. It underlies everything, including how finance departments are run. The importance of data and knowing, and the absence of it, which undermines much of our capability for good decision making. And of course, the need to really think much harder about what institutional structures should look like for an India that is in some ways much more integrated, much more interconnected, but also at the same time grappling with these very divergent contexts, which will only create deeper tensions as we go forward. So maybe the need for stronger institutions, stronger planning departments, stronger collective deliberative planning, or whatever word we may use, is an important theme that we need to build more into our public discourse also about fiscal federalism. I'm going to just open it up quickly for a few questions and comments from the House before we formally close.
Hi, I'm Shivangi Tripathi. I'm a scholar from the Indian School of Public Policy. And my question is, oftentimes states are unable to execute centrally sponsored schemes like Mangrega, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana because of a lack of disbursement of the funds allocated by the centre or the union government. What do you suggest to make this process more transparent?
Thank you.
Sir, for a project that
we'll take 4 and then we'll do a round of responses.
For a project that we have been doing on fiscal federalism and health, one of the common themes and surprising themes was that there is an inherent flexibility in centrally sponsored schemes. It's about how creative you are in actually getting it, and it's a lot about individual bargaining. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Hi sir, my name is Anuswaya. I wanted to ask you, as you mentioned that India is a current account deficit country, at the same time, the central bank is constantly intervening in currency depreciation. So what are your thoughts on that? And a second question quickly, that there are various political parties which are under scrutiny for giving free commodities, freebies basically. So at a time when Indian states are in bad financial shape, this might have a potential to add India's fiscal deficit. So your thoughts on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a last hand at the back there. Yeah, the lady in the...
Hi. So my question is to the Honorable Finance Minister, and this is specific to the Supreme Court's recent ruling on the GST Council in the Mohit Minerals case, where they have said it's no longer binding. The recommendations are not binding on the union and the state. And one of the possible interpretations of that has been that it opens up a space for fiscal flexibility for the states to decide SGST rates, procedures, and regime. But do you actually think that is something that states might take up and actually do? Practically, how feasible or possible it might be?
I'll start with the last question first. I think that there was nothing in the ruling that was actually new, right? I think just by coincidence, many of the lawyers who argued in that case are personally known to me. And so I've had extensive discussions. In fact, I had 2 or 3 of them down to Chennai and brought in my other advisory team, and we had an extensive couple-hour conversation. Actually, the case should never have gone into those kinds of things, right? The case was a simple, if you have purchased something FOB in Germany, should it be subject to GST in Gujarat? Right? That was the actual case. I think sometimes the lawyers kind of unnecessarily drag issues. At the end, though, the judgment was very clear. It just restated that you cannot abrogate the constitutional powers of elected bodies like a legislature or a parliament through some statutory body like a GST council. And therefore, at some level, none of this is binding. And then it goes into all these minutiae, right? Like the overarching legislation, the primary legislation, then the addendums and the modifications, then the rate setting. Which of these is like not flexible and which of these is flexible? And it gets a bit complicated. But the design itself had that weakness in it. There's no way you can force something. I mean, what is the notion of democracy? If I have to go back and amend my Commercial Tax Act to implement a new rate set by the GST Council, then forcing that as a preordained thing is simply against the notion of democracy. Why were elected people sent to the legislature then? So I think in some sense it was just pointing out an existing flaw. I don't think it really broke new ground. The existing flaw, again, is that, I don't want to repeat stuff I've said before, but as I've said from the beginning, and I'm saying this apart from politics, I think the vision of GST was overreaching in the first place. It was implemented with the legal documents and so forth that left a lot of lacunae. Then the implementation was rushed overnight for timing and dramatic effect. That left a lot of problems, which led to a lot of modifications. But beyond all that, it is what it is. Even yesterday, I had a series of conversations because the next GST Council meeting, Honorable Union Finance Minister has graciously indicated it will happen in Madurai at my request. So I came to help make preparations. And with the team there, I pointed out several things that are just pending and have been pending for a year or more. So the application of mind and resources and data analysis and technology is woefully inadequate. I mean, if it is the source of so much of our income, of our revenue, we should be putting in 10 times the effort for this, right? And so many vacant positions. There's a vision for about 10 IAS level officers from the states that have to be part of this secretariat. Right now, 0. There's not a single person from any of the states sitting in this job. Right? So I think GST has a lot of issues. I'm not sure this judgment, other than shining a light at inherent flaws, I'm not sure it changes the game dramatically. On the centrally sponsored schemes, the union government is getting more and more kind of granular and almost at a nano level. Every single person, every single payment, they want to know, when, how, etc., and from one account and so forth. But part of the problem is that the timing of release of funds is not prospective. It's always retrospective. And some places, for good reasons or even simply for political reasons, we want to release the money on time. So, very, very often we find there's a timing mismatch. And in places where it's only the union's funds, maybe we can cite the union as the bottleneck and deliver late. But at least in Tamil Nadu, in almost every scheme, our rates of payment are much higher than what the union pays. And so our component, at least, we want to get to the people. And it's very hard for us to run two parallel accounts where we send, this part of the daily wage separately and that part of the daily wage separately. In terms of the flexibility, I completely agree. I mean, I'm discovering slowly because I'm new to the job that a scheme is designed and it's, implemented or announced in the budget, and then the real work starts. And then there's so many different ways of interpretation. There's, so much flexibility. And I don't want to name names because they're friends of mine. But some states' finance ministers basically live in Delhi, right? They don't live in their state capitals because their own finances are so stressed that a good friend of mine says he spends about 10 days a month in Delhi and 5 days a month in Bombay at the RBI, and only the rest of the time in his state. So I think part of my problem or my limitation is that we have so much control of our own finances and very little need to go and ask for special treatment that I have not leveraged this kind of flexibility. But and I say this apart from politics. Most ministers and most IAS officers are very reasonable human beings who want to help and who are willing to be flexible and thoughtful about how they do things. So I don't think that's really an issue. As far as the freebies go, I just worry there's so much noise and so little light in this debate, right? Sometimes it just becomes like, beyond ironic. If giving something for free or at low cost or subsidized value was the basis for all kinds of problems at the states, why did the union cabinet, day before yesterday, decide to give 800 million people free food for 3 more months? Is it that if you do it from Delhi, it must be developmental, and if you do it from Tamil Nadu, it must be profligate? It's like nonsense, right? It's just complete. The debate lacks any fundamental internal logic or consistency. Whatever I do must be wrong, whatever you do must be right. It's nonsense. It's a meaningless debate. I don't know too many states where the primary reason for their fiscal problems is because they gave something for free. In fact, at least in Tamil Nadu, that is the last problem. We've got all kinds of other problems. The fact that we give more rice or more pension to women or, a better subsidy to farmers or, a lot of these schemes, right? I don't want to get into this, but I just want to make a point. There's a crop insurance scheme that's called PM Fasal, there's some Fasal Bima something, yeah. So we have to call that PM Fasal BY. But if you actually look at the funding of it, 25% of it comes from the union and 75% comes from our own revenues. Every single scheme that comes branded with PM XYZ, this is true. Some portion, usually at the best case 60-40 on the year 1 of inception, going down effectively to 20-80 or 0-100, will be funded by states' own revenues, and that is the basis on which you agree to participate. And then they'll call us and say, no, but the logo is not in the right place. The picture is not here. The money is our money, right? Like in the house building, the union government provides 1,20,000 or something. We give 4,80,000, 6 lakh per house. We give 4 times what the union gives, but it's still called some union, PM something house scheme. It helps us a little bit because they insist on putting all these schemes in Hindi or Sanskrit words, and so nobody in Tamil Nadu understands what it means. So we actually put the math when we give the beneficiary. We say, here's how much came from the union, here's how much came from the state. You can figure out, since the average education is high school graduate, they know where the money really came from, right? But this kind of branding value is overstressed, in my opinion.
Ratin, sorry, just before you respond, I know Arup had a question, so we can maybe take two more questions and then you can cluster the responses just so we have as many questions.
Thank you, Yamini. This question is either for Dr. Roy or for the Honorable FM. Dr. Roy, as you mentioned, that the situation where the political power in India is concentrated in the northern states and the economic power is concentrated in the southern and western states. Now we have a bigger parliament, there will be delimitation sometime in the future. And whichever way you work it, whichever census you take, again it will be more of the same, that you win UP and Bihar and the northern eastern states, you have the political power, and the economic power stays in the southern states and western states. And as you said, that is not good for our fiscal compact. So is there a way around it? I mean, this ties to the larger issue of southern states speaking on how the 15th Finance Commission did not reward them enough for their population control measures, among other issues. So is there a way around this? Is there a way to prevent concentration of political power in the northern states and the economic power in the southern? Make it more broad-based, basically.
I'm not a politician, but I can tell you end states that would resolve the problem. If you accepted my great-grandfather in Maharashtra from what is now Bangladesh, will you accept in permanent? See, there are only two solutions to this. It's very simple, actually, if you're an economist, or you don't even read, it's common sense. Either people from UP go and live in the south, the boot hypothesis, right? And people from Bihar go and live in Maharashtra, they eventually become part of the majority electorate there, and labor migrates to where prosperity is. I thought we were one country and we're supposed to do that, but somehow it's not happening. I'm not a politician, I don't know how. What? Or capital migrates to the north, where it is scarce and wages are lower, and therefore prosperity equalizes. So the equalization can come in the final instance through one or both of these two factors of production moving. They are not moving. They have not been moving for 25 years, and I need to understand why not. That's a political conversation, that's a political economy conversation. It is a very important national conversation. We have a diplomat here. I'm going to give you one word: Yugoslavia. So let me go back to easier things. Disbursement. Okay, now this is a bit, I take all the minister's points, and he's right. And in an ideal world, the finance ministry should be dispersing well. There is a politics to this, but the states, at least Tamil Nadu and other relatively prosperous states, not just, have some levers. They have levers because when I was on the committee to decide the WMA limits, these are the limits that states can have to access short-term borrowing, we were only bothered about Punjab. Because Punjab was living on WMA, still lives on it. And so we said we have to keep the rates high enough that Punjab is okay. So that means the other states have lots of space. If it's a cash flow problem, 1 month, 2 months, the problem is that in the current dispensation, what has happened is not the finance ministry. You see, every single line department now has its own centrally sponsored scheme. And bureaucrats respond like everyone else to incentives. So health ministry was a crap place to be until they got their whatever Ayushman, I can't remember. Now they have a centrally sponsored scheme. Now once you have that, I'm powerful, I'm the health secretary. Education now very powerful, right? They have all this Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So money, bureaucrats, there are 5 incentives bureaucrats have, and one is the size of the budget you control. It's very important. And it's normal, it's all over the world. So in that situation, the reluctance to give up contracting, that discretionary power will be high. Now, earlier you had the planning commission where these things could be mediated. Now you don't have that. So what I think you are facing in Tamil Nadu is not recourse to finance. Because if he knew the money was coming in 6 months, he could go and do WMA. It's okay. It's unpredictability. Because the moment you come into Photwa ko aise lagao or aise lagao, you don't know whether you're going to get the money or not. And you just may not tomorrow. So that, I think, is the major problem. The second was on flexibility. I think there is plenty of flexibility in budgeting. You have to, it's a bit like when I worked in the UN, I did something and the operations manager said, you can't do this. So I asked the right question. I said, how can I do this? She said, you're the first person to ask me that question. I'll tell you how to do it. So if you listen to your officers, they've been in the game a long time, they will give you your flexibility to move money here and there. I think this is also a little bit overblown, this idea that we don't have flexibility. We have plenty of flexibility. In a country like India, which is, benevolent, despot-oriented, many benevolent despots in the states and in the center, when they want something done, it is done. Have you not seen that? Ye karo, ho jata. So flexibility is there. You need to have the ability to direct your political capital to the things you want, and that's a political argument again. And the finance ministry will quite rightly try and stop you, but they will not succeed normally if there is enough political capital invested. On the central bank freebies, I completely agree with you. You know, I mean, my remedy is your gulab jamun. So, but on the central bank issue, no. I would say the central bank has done an excellent job. Problem is they've become so bad at communication, so bad. Their grammar, their analytics, and the way they put out stuff. Today I was reading something which was put in the governor's mouth. It's obviously not the governor. Somebody writes these things for him. Says that there was a liquidity deficit. What does that mean? What's a liquidity deficit? Because the deficit means there's be a zero somewhere. And then you have a positive and you have a negative, right? So you can have tight liquidity, loose liquidity. You can't have a deficit. So, and you know, central bank governor speeches, every word is watched and weighed. Believe me, every word. You have to take that job very seriously. But again, this is broadly what has happened, like called the trivialization of policy making. But otherwise, we are in good hands. Our reserves are in excellent shape. This business of saying that, you know, it's like the rupee has fallen to its lowest ever level. When you have permanent current account deficit, the rupee will fall. So it will always be lower than, you know, 6 months ago or last year. Like that now, reserves are the lowest level in the last 2 years. Well, that's great. You're not saying the reserves are at their lowest level since 1991. Then I'd be worried. But last 2 years is okay. There's plenty of room there, and the central bank is quite correctly targeting exchange rate volatility. That's all they're targeting. They're just not able to somehow say it properly. And I don't know why. It's unfortunate. So it's a comms problem, I would say. That's it.
Thank you. He just wants to quick response, and then we'll just take 2 questions after that.
I wanted to say something about the ways and means, right? Just even today, I had this conversation with my finance secretary who was here and just left for Chennai. And we were talking about cost of funding and how it's so much more cheap, like 2 or 3 points cheaper, the interest rate, to take the ways and means from time to time. And in fact, being right time, right place, doing the right things with the right support from the Chief Minister, we're actually running much, much, much better than we thought, both in terms of deficits and borrowings and all that, and also in cash. So we're sitting on like, 5,000 or 6,000 crores of cash. And it's very inefficient because we're borrowing at 8%, and it isn't all. But there's a political kind of flavor, because so far the only people who have had to go to ways and means, at least in our history, is those who were so with their backs to the wall that they couldn't access regular funding. So even if we were to do it just for interest rate optimization or coupon optimization or liquidity optimization, there's a political landmine there that we have to deal with. So these are things I think over time with dialogue we have to kind of improve. But I want to take a little bit of segue and touch on something that Adam said yesterday. I used to read a lot, and after I've come to politics, unfortunately, I don't have time to read anything other than reports or budgets or analysis. So I'm becoming less learned man. But what's happening amazingly is that I go through some experience, I arrive at some conclusion, and then I go to some event and I find somebody has already figured this out before, and I've just reinvented the wheel, right? So just like 2 or 3 days ago, we had a conversation with the Chief Minister about we've started this model breakfast program. We're starting test from 1 to 5, and then we were talking about a bunch of things, and finally, this is exactly what I said to him. I said, if we can figure out how to scale this operationally, then, I don't care what it costs, we'll find the money. It's never about the money. I agree that if we can actually do it. But now the question is, there are many ways of actually doing it, and I think that's also the point I wanted to make. So we were the pioneers in the noon meal scheme. It started in the 1920s with the Justice Party. Different parties came and went. Through Kamraj expanded it greatly. Through MGR expanded it even further. Our leader came and added eggs and made it protein rich. Everybody had their hand in making it bigger. But today, the noon meal scheme, it costs us, let's say, 100 rupees, or let's say whatever, some 6,000 or 8,000 crores. 70% of that is labor. Only 30% of that goes to actual food and energy and, the actual preparation and delivery and all that stuff. So when we went to the breakfast program, we didn't want to replicate this. We didn't want to, go into such an inefficient, because the question is, of course you want to provide service. Of course you want to provide, benefits to the people. But if the cost of provision is so high, then the real question is, are you doing it for the end beneficiary or the intermediary, right? Many of our universities, the staff to student ratio is so inverted that, I often ask the question, is it run for the sake of students or for the sake of the employees, right? This is, many of our institutions are like that. So what we decided to do was do these pilots where we would get the parents of the children themselves in every panchayat, have them formed into self-help groups and give block grants to the panchayat, and the panchayat would then enable these parents to purchase what they needed to arrange for the rest, and for the parents to cook the food and feed their children, right? And then give them some stipend or something like that. And it has been such an improvement over this, this old noon meal scheme. And we're getting so much greater efficiency, much better quality. And, some genius, of course, on social media said, isn't there going to be more corruption? And I asked the fundamental question, is there more likely to be corruption if I was to do a 2,000 crore tender at the state level than if I had 12,000 villages where the parents were buying food for their children, right? So I think we can actually do things, but we can do them in some cases much more efficiently and much more resiliently and with checks and balances than other things. And I think it makes a big difference that we should focus on how we actually do, not just that we actually do. And I think that's an important thing in finance, at least in outcomes that we need to be thoughtful of.
Hi, it's been an important discussion so far, and I thank both the minister and the professor for that. My question pertains, it's addressed for the whole panel, and it pertains to the state public sector undertakings. Why I'm asking this is because it is tied not just to the questions of resource generation and usage, but also for the development goals which state PSUs were intended to fulfill. And the question is as follows, which is that if you cut state PSUs from any angle, which means that if you look at the state electricity boards, the irrigation departments, SRTUs, or just state public sector enterprises, for decades they have underperformed. And underperformance, if you measure it in terms of a rate of return, it has been negative and abysmally negative in many of the states. So my first question is, why has it been so hard to take necessary action pertaining to state PSUs for so long, when you clearly have evidence that they have been a drain on resources which could have, if handled well, used efficiently?
Thanks.
The second question, very quickly, is regarding the data availability, which is what Professor Ratin was mentioning, that if I don't know how bad these things are, how will I even take necessary action on that? So at a state level, you don't have surveys being disseminated of the same kind that center does for, say CPSUs. So I'm just wondering, why has it been hard to work on state PSUs?
Thanks.
Thank you.
And there was a hand behind you there. Keep it short.
Thank you so much. There is so much debate about freebies. So my question is very different from the earlier discussion is, between this debate that some schemes are being launched by the central government and state government, and in an effort, we are reducing citizens into beneficiaries. So what are we doing to empower the citizens and not reduce them into just beneficiaries? That's my question.
Thanks.
Can I start with your question? I think that's a very important question. It depends on what kind of democracy you think India is. As far as I can see, you want to be treated as beneficiaries. Because मांगे करते हैं ना सरकार से कि हमें ये दो वो दो, अन्नदाता है सरकार, दान देती है शिक्षा की. I want to take on the case of education. I've had long discussions with Yamini on this. You see, Kerala did not get education because the Joint Secretary was very competent at delivering education in Kerala. Kerala got education because it had a social movement. Right? No, he might have been competent otherwise. But the point was there was a political movement in Kerala for universal education. On the back of that political movement, Kerala educated. Tamil Nadu is similar. It came later in the curve. Today, conversations on education are technocratic. Totally technocratic. कि वो mother tongue में करे या इस पे करे या उस पे करे या Montessori में जाए या. There's no politics to education because actually people don't want education. They want credentials. And because they want credentials, they want seats in a rationed environment. And because they want seats, They are beneficiaries. So you become a beneficiary of a college reservation, you become a beneficiary of a food recipient. There is no movement. And I'll take Mr. Tyagarajan's example. The right to food movement in Tamil Nadu, and he correctly elided it with the self-respect movement, was a political measure. It was not कि हमारे बच्चे भूखे हैं, so let us अन्नदाता उनको पैसा देगा और फोटो लगाएंगे. That was not the attitude. So the beneficiary approach that we have taken, I hate that word, is a fundamentally undemocratic, disempowering approach. But you will do it when you fail in your main project. And I have written on this elsewhere. We have failed in India, my generation has failed you, in the sense that our development trajectory has been woefully inadequate. As a result, we have spent more and more money in the 4 phases that you have, compensating you for the failures of development. I can give you a much more less politically sort of charged explanation. In India, corporate taxes, we have 19 exemptions. Okay? Why do we have those exemptions? Because we can't deliver a business environment. So I say, so sorry, you can't do R&D in India because it's very difficult to do R&D in India, it's a nightmare. I'll give you an R&D exemption. So when Mr. Jaitley quite correctly wanted to remove them, I said, be very careful, because there's a logic to these exemptions. They were all given because India was not a good place to do business. So first you have to make it a better place, and then you remove it, which I think the government is doing. So on the beneficiaries point, I think this is very, very important. And what is the other question?
The other question was about PSUs.
Oh, that is Mr. Tyagarajan is a domain expert, but I'm from Maharashtra and I will disagree with you. My BST is a PSU. Okay? And the World Bank, which is not known to like many things Indian, actually sent London Transport to come and look at BST. So that's how you run a bus service. Okay? So it is not true. In fact, it is profoundly untrue that all state government undertakings are loss-making. And if they were, you wouldn't be able to privatize them anyway. In the power sector, we have a specific problem with discourse. But I would not conflate that to all state government undertakings.
The last word to you.
They are very complex issues. I think I published a white paper last year, around August or so, on the state of Tamil Nadu's finances. And a whole section was devoted to public sector undertakings. So, it's not politically wise for me to go into opinion. So I'll just give you some facts. The Tamil Nadu Water Administration Department, TWAD, has 3 times the number of retirees as employees. And so the pension costs are so high. The Tamil Nadu electricity, what used to be called the electricity board, now called TANGEDCO, TANDISCO, TANTRANSCO, all the different entities. The debt on those entities went up from 45,000 crores to 1,45,000 crores in 5 years. The Tamil Nadu transport corporations, every rupee of revenue, before we contemplate the cost of diesel or the cost of amortizing the bus value, is already spent on wages and pensions. It's more than that. What other PSU would we have? The Tamil Nadu Civil Supplies Corporation used to be a debt-free organization. Over the course of the last 5 years, it is now routinely runs about 10,000 crores a year in debt. But because it's a kind of revolving debt, it has to pay it back and borrow it again. So something structurally wrong in the administration and the business model of these. I think it's a confluence of politics plus some myths and cliches about vote banks and stuff like that. I think it's fixable, but this is common to many states, so it's not a Tamil Nadu problem. I just happen to have quantified it last year, just to expose the extent of the issues. One thing the 15th Finance Commission has done, which though it's painful in the short term, is hugely beneficial in the long term. They have brought in a recommendation which was adopted, which said that if you borrow money in a PSU or any other government-controlled or owned entity, in a transaction that requires a government guarantee, which means the credit rating of that entity is not sufficient to borrow. You'll have to get an actual written government guarantee. And there is no path to repayment in the kind of business model, right? In your financial statements of the year, there's no repayment path to that debt. Then that debt must be included in the state's borrowing limit. So you can no longer do such off-balance sheet borrowing without constraint. Of course, the union government did a lot of it between 14 and 19 in Food Corporation of India and other places. No, I don't know whether it's for the center, but it's for us. Of course, very often it's one rule for you, one rule for me, so it may not be for them. But for the states, that rule is in effect. So that has helped us actually, in the finance department at least, draw the line somewhere and say that if we're going to sign off on these guarantees, then we are going to have the cut in some other borrowings. Therefore, some reforms and things are needed. Actually, it's a very skewed system, right? Because if the state is the majority or the 100% shareholder, but in fact, there's no department, there's something called the BPE in Tamil Nadu, the Bureau of Public Enterprises, inside the finance department, which is run by an additional secretary. But till I came and I started asking questions, it wasn't clear to me the extent to which the BPE exercised any kind of control. So after we've come, we've discovered some old GOs that were not being followed, adapted and reissued them, put in some new guidelines, and say that no matter what the board does, because we are the 100% shareholder, some decisions have to come for government ratification from the BPE before they can be enacted. And I think that kind of control was missing for many years in many places. So now I think it's more in, thanks to the Finance Commission, thanks to some steps we've taken. So I think we can, these can be improved and cleaned up a bit. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing to you on my recent experience in England. Actually two things. One, remember that we are fiscally constrained because we are not a rich country. We might be the 5th largest, 4th largest, I don't care. To understand this, understand that the minimum level of income tax in India kicks in at 3 times the per capita income. In the UK, it kicks in at 1/3 the per capita income. That's your fiscal gap, just to bring it back to fiscal, okay? So before you start celebrating the 5th largest economy, remember that we are the poorest country in the G20, and that has fiscal implications. But I wanted to end on a positive note. I discovered, and I hope this is true, I hope nobody's calling a midday meal a freebie, or free universal school means in India a freebie, right? I have the asset of the house here. Yeah. Nobody thinks that's revdi, I hope. Okay. I was shocked to see that in England, all of England, if you earn more than the per capita income or more than 1/3 the per capita income, you have to pay for your school meals. So there was a terrible interview of a dinner lady, as they're called, coming there and saying that I didn't take this job to turn away kids from eating. So we have got some things right here. We need to do more of those.
In fact, it brings me back to something that Adam said yesterday as well, which is maybe one way to think about the relatively low spending on social protection, human capital in India is how much we can achieve despite that low spending, which might be cause for some celebration against the backdrop of so many challenges. Just to sort of circle back to, we spoke a little bit about possible reforms, possible institutional moves. You mentioned very casually that you brought out a white paper, and it reminded me how rare the white paper is in the structure of our government, both at the center and at states. So while we grapple with these bigger questions of state capacity, of institutional reform, of the big challenges, maybe there is actually something very core to how the executive used to function or is imagined to function, which we've forgotten, which are these old school things of writing white papers, speaking notes that give everybody in the community, citizens, policy stakeholders, all of us the opportunity to really understand what's going on behind the thinking that then comes out in the form of budget numbers that we spend a rather endless amount of time debating. We will continue to do so, after all, that's the one thing that gives us some employment. But it'll be better if it's backed up with the white papers, so the nature of the conversations are better, and it might be the start of a more robust state capacity. On that note, thank you very, very much for an absolutely wonderful conversation.